Okay, so sorry for doing my talk in English. I know that a lot of you don't really speak that much English, but I'm much more comfortable in it. I will talk to you about abstract components, abstractions, and I work at Algolia, which is a search as a service company. But let's start with something else. Let's start with abstract art. You can go really far in it. You can look at this, for example, this piece of art by Picasso, which is called The Kitchen, which you can recognize maybe something. There's a face there. Or you can go a completely different way and you go to something that's very surreal, something that looks like it could be true, but also looks like it couldn't at all. Or things that are just slightly off, like this work by Magritte. All of these artworks, in a way, they are there for capturing ideas. And you can say that about abstract art, but also about figurative art. All of it is there to capture an ideal, a thing that you have in your mind, and you abstract that idea and you make it into a thing, a piece of art. But that's super vague and stuff like that. So let's talk about components, because you understand those. I will talk about components in a general sense. They can be Vue, React, Angular, Vanilla. It's basically all the same, because day to day I work on all of them, basically. And what those actually are about implementing ideas. It's just like art, in a way, where you have an idea, you have a message you want to send. This is something you can make, and this is how you make it. So this is the definition. These are my things that I wrote. You give it some arguments, and then you get some output. If you go a bit more in detail about this output, you basically get this graph of needs. You have, as the y-axis, you have what I call the look. The things that you visually see. For example, which HTML elements are being used, or for example, what the styling is, or what the functionality of those things is. And on the other hand, you have the logic, how this functionality is actually implemented, how this is shared between other things. Maybe it needs to send requests and things like that. The goal at the end of components, or as an app as a whole, is to get to the top right. You want to get something that does all your logic and does all your look. And what I specifically work on is on stuff which helps you make or achieve at least part of that. Because we are making a search engine, we're making a search interface. That's not a whole app. That's part of your app. And we want to get as far as possible on the top right, so you need to do as little as possible to achieve what you want. But those examples of abstract art we had before, they would actually make for fairly bad abstractions if you would see them in the sense of code. If you look at this one, for example, I think it's very obvious that this one is too simplified. You cannot achieve everything you want, for example, looking at the picture of a kitchen, from this piece of artwork. You can, maybe that wasn't the goal of Picasso, but if what we want to achieve here is looking at the picture of a kitchen, that wasn't it. So if I would graph this, you would get the artwork, which is somewhat there, which is the blue. It does all the logic of the kitchen, but it doesn't do all the view of it. And then you got to do something more yourself. Let's take it a notch more to reality. Let's think about a search bar. Here we have, it's an input, it has some other stuff, it has buttons as well, and it has a placeholder there. I mean, in fact, this is just text, but imagine it's a placeholder. If you want to use this with our library, this example is Vue, and I will switch through different frameworks to the presentation. But you just import and you use a component, and that is then the whole of the search box. Now, if you want to update that placeholder, you want to update the placeholder like that, pretty obviously. But what that needs to do behind the scenes is then forward these props, these arguments, towards which you are passing as one of the internal components. Because in this case, we have 5 internal components. You have a form, you have some buttons, and things like that. You need to forward the props from one element towards multiple elements. Let's take a look at the second abstraction. Here we see that while this is super pretty, it might not make somebody, might be just too much for somebody who just wants to tell the time, for example. So it's too imaginative. What I mean by that on the graph is that the abstraction went way further than what you wanted as a user. For example, our previous search box, it had the buttons and things like that. What if in your design you don't need those at all? So for that reason, and this is Vue again, we use the things that the library offers, that the framework offers, to give you access to override the whole view yourself and make it yourself, as simple as possible. So you go and do a slot here. The implementation is fairly unimportant because you can do this in all frameworks. But the idea is that you give somebody the tools to be able to remake the logic, the view, without needing to redo the logic of the search box. They never need to go look and how a search box actually works. This is a simple example. We also have more complicated ones, of course, but those wouldn't really fit on the slides. But the idea is we have one function which you can pass to a change handler, refine, and the value, which is then passed also from higher above. If we look at the next one here, maybe this signifies eating an apple. Maybe it doesn't, but it's just slightly off. You get to something where this is not what you wanted to do. So it's too unreal. You get to a situation where some of the logic is missing. This person isn't eating an apple, the apple is just in front of them, and there's something missing there. So on that graph, it would be when the logic's there, or the ideas are there, but the view's not at all. A quick example there is if you have a numeric filter, so numbers that go in a range and you have multiple of those. But if you want to click on one, you should clear it again, or something like that. It's an example. You'd want to be able to compose or take multiple of these abstractions that signify maybe a numeric menu and a clear all thing, and put them together. The main goal of our set of abstractions is to get you to the goal. The easiest is, of course, just using exactly what we said, and it might just bring you to the goal. Just the search box, no options, other things, no options, it all brings you to the thing. But then we still want to bring other levels of abstraction, other things that allow you to go, for example, just take a part of what we made and then the rest yourself and also get to your goal, because maybe the original one didn't do exactly what you wanted. So some properties of good abstractions. It should be easy to add a new thing on that same level. It should be easy to add a new component, a new property, a new underlying thing, whatever you have. You shouldn't need to think about it. It should just follow a pattern. A good abstraction is also easy to override. You don't want to be too opinionated about almost anything that you can't afford to be super opinionated on. For example, we choose to be fairly opinionated that every time an action happens, this will then send a new request and a new response. This is because we choose to do it like that, and we choose to say this is our library, this is our abstraction, and it will always do requests and it will always do responses. And a good abstraction should also prevent mistakes. It shouldn't allow somebody to make something that isn't good. A good example of a good abstraction was we just saw before is the types in Elm, where you will look for the complete, the exhaustivity of the cases. This is still all fairly vague, so I'd like to bring it a little more practical. The first thing that we do, and this is very particular for our use case, where we have 4 component libraries, one in Vue, in React, in Angular, and in Vanilla.js, that all try to share as much code as possible. To be able to do that practically, you need to split up. And the way that we split it up is between the logic that is shared between these concepts. So a search box is still a search box if it's in Vue or if it's in Angular, but it will not be rendered the same. So we split up between the logic that deals with requests and responses and whatever, and then uses that in a abstract way, in a generic way within the components. The next thing that is good for that we try to work on is consistency, and we also have some processes in place to go through. I will go through these things in a bit. Then the one that I will go through last and that I love the most is a tiered abstraction. So how do we split up things? Imagine you have your libraries, Vue and React and Angular, and they have their thing completely as if would be the case if you make a React library, if you make an Angular library. It's all code of this framework. We then split it up where anything to do that is the same between all of them, like network handling, the common names of parameters, the concepts, are separate things. So the components on one side and what we call the connectors on the other side. You might recognize this pattern from Dan Abramop's quite famous blog post, Presentational and Container Components, which talks specifically about this concept within React. The fun part about that is that he, earlier this year, wrote an update to that thing that he doesn't think it's a good idea anymore, which completely makes sense if you're talking about React, because right now it has a very good abstraction hooks to avoid needing to create new components just to share logic. However, in our case, we need to share logic between frameworks, so you still need to split that up. Then consistency. So it's always a bit of a balance between trying to get to know this new framework, this new library very well, and trying to fit in, and being consistent within all of your libraries. Because on one hand, not many people will switch from Angular to Vue and use your same thing. Like not many of your customers. So they will only be exposed to one thing, and they will not really notice that. On the other hand, it creates a massive support load if every one of the libraries is just slightly different. So the way that we go for that is we first experiment, we make stuff, and we just make it work. Like make it work, kind of hacky maybe here and there, but it works. And then we continue experimenting, see like, you know what if we had this new concept and it would work there to share maybe results from different data sets or things like that. How would this fit within this framework? And then after that experimentation phase is over, you go and you spec out everything out. So right now we already spec'd everything out. We decided what the names of all the components are, what the names of all the connectors are, what the names of all the options are, and things like that. And then when you add something new to the mix, you need to figure out before it goes to stable if everything can be a one-to-one match. Usually it can, but you might need new concepts, and then you add them to the specs and you add them everywhere. Like that. The way we do these kind of things is with an RFC process. So at ours, this is fairly closed because maybe we talk about new features and you don't want to leak them and things like that. But basically the idea is you have a markdown document that is a template, and you say what your change is expected to be, you describe why the change should be done, why it should not be done, what the impact is of the change, stuff like that. You write it all down in a document. In our case, we put this on GitHub, and then we make a pull request when the so RFC stands for request for comments, when you actually request the comments there. Then when we go through a process, and it depends on how you go, but basically everybody reviews it, you get a consensus, and then you implement whatever was needed to be implemented. This really helps with making changes that you know will take a very long time. For example, in the version of for React, we had the concept where you could get results from different data sets with the same parameters, and then things being merged and things like that. We had this concept as a component. In the vanilla version, this was not a component. Those were two different instances of the search, and it was actually fairly hard to keep them in sync. So the process that we go is, in React we try it out, it works, and then it's shipped and things like that, and then we think back and we make sure that it goes, and then it goes through the whole process, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about these tiered abstractions, and why I think that they're very good. So this is a quick example. Here I'm talking about Svelte. We don't currently have an implementation in Svelte, which is another front-end framework that just had their new major version yesterday. And I wanted to prove that our abstractions were fairly good. So today, in a few hours, I used our abstractions to make this. If you're interested, in the end, I tweeted about it. So what you have here is we have the same kind of thing as we had earlier, and you see that the first layer, the first tier, is things that are already an abstraction by the lower level. So the lower level here is DOM, and the abstraction of the DOM is the fact that if you give a placeholder parameter, then it will actually put the placeholder on the text. So what we do here is we forward any props to the corresponding elements, and you should always make sure that you choose the right ones. Maybe a click handler. How do you make a click handler on something as big as that? Maybe you add it to everything, and that's a bunch of decisions you need to make, but that helps. Then the next thing is these hits, or the results. What we can do is we add, and this is all mostly Svelte code. You use the abstraction, the platform here, to make something in which you can read and override a part of it. So here we read and we override the parts where you want to have the highlight result of the attribute name. And then you can go a step further when you don't want just one of the items and then all of them the same. Maybe you want to render your list in a very specific way. So then you go further and you allow also the overriding with slots again to read from all the items and override the DOM for all the items instead. Or then maybe you decide that even that was not enough and you need access to the lifecycle hooks or something like that of the thing for your specific component. Then you take our underlying abstraction that has all of the logic, all of the logic of the search box, and then you and here you see it in action, how it's being used. So the connector basically takes a callback, which will be called every time something changes over the whole search interface, and it gives you a state that is specific for this search box. So that's an object that has the query and a function refined. So we just reassign here, and this is idiomatic Svelte code because reassigning will cause updates, a reactive update. And then we still want to be able to go one level lower. We still want to be able to make maybe a very special search box that does things differently. Maybe it's a bad example, but maybe a very special list of refinements where you can also click no instead of just adding. Then what we have is you need to make your own connector. So if you want to make a custom connector, this is a function that's been called 2 times, so a curried function, which eventually returns an object. And then inside that, so in here the render function is what we passed in the previous example, is the thing where you update, framework specific. And then the second one has the parameters for that, for the widget, that are independent of the framework thing. So for example, in a search box, you could say search as you type true or false. Then finally, in this object, we have a function render, which gets given specific helpers that are good for the whole search interface, allow you to implement things like setting the query, causing a search, and things like that. And in there, you call your thing again, and then you give the data how you want. You read it and you write it how you want. Because the way that it works inside the library, every time something changes, that is very similar to then the Elm and the Redux and stuff like that. We go over all of the widgets that are currently mounted, and then each of those we call the render function with the new state, because the helper has its own state as well. To conclude, if you make an abstraction, make sure that it's easy to extend, easy to override, level by level. You never want to end up in a state where you just want to update the placeholder, but you need to understand how the complete underlying things work. Or you don't want to end up in a time where you are relying completely on internal stuff that is not exported, so people cannot make their own things. It's very useful to experiment first and then consolidate. So first you want to see at everything from a fresh view, because these frameworks, they're not all the same. Right now they're all converging on components and things like that, and that's a common concept. But every new thing has its reason for being new, so you need to really look into that. And then the last thing that I didn't mention early, but abstract for what you need. So you don't want to make a whole abstraction that allows you to make these connectors, for example, if that's not what you need. You don't want to make something more reusable than necessary. And of course, ask for feedback for the users that you have. So the way that we go is we publish them as betas, we talk to customers who want to try it out one-on-one and things like that. Thank you very much. Yes?
Did you find a case when you plugged your search stuff into an external framework, like Vue or Angular or whatever, where the steered abstraction concept, where you first pass the render function provided by the framework, does not work because it's not how the framework works. It doesn't provide the render function, it provides something else that don't fit the abstraction. Do you already find the case?
No, because that's not completely how it works. It's rather you just need to find a hook in the framework, in this case, where you can cause an update to happen based on what was just based on a callback. Because we have our own lifecycle, that's called, in which we have the lifecycle where you can listen to it, and in that one, all we need to do is keep a specific variable updated. In the very worst case, but I haven't seen it yet, because in Vue and in Angular you can just update properties, and the same in Svelte you can just update properties and it will cause a reactive update. In React you need to call setState, but that's the same. Even in the very worst case, there must be some kind of escape hatch in that library to cause some kind of update from outside of the lifecycle. I haven't found but of course it's always possible, and then we need to rethink it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you share the different options between the different frameworks?
The options of the
configuration of your component, for example. If you have options that never change, or are the different options that
yes.
the user doesn't touch
We don't particularly share, but we do write them down in our specs document, where we say what, because the reason why we didn't go for any machine readable kind of specs, which just, it's machine readable, it's just a YAML of all the options, all the description, all their default and things like that. But the reason why we don't specifically use them in our components is because they don't change very often. And so it would be a lot of work for us. So that's again, you don't need to abstract where you only need to do it 4 times.
So it's hard-coded?
It's hard-coded. In each of the components, we copy the default from our file. Yes.
An alternative to having an abstraction would be like to provide like building blocks and let the users combine them. Can you share some insight on why having an abstraction works better for a user?
I think the main thing is that it's quite underestimated how hard these components actually are, and every time we end up with trying to help somebody make or maybe we have a special button or a special input and things like that, it turns out that there's still a lot more to do, and we like to make it as easy as possible. However, we're starting to see the use cases where a person wants to override what we have for our components, the defaulting, but only a little bit. The way that we would, maybe for example, they don't want a clear button, and you can give options for everything, right? And that's a leaky abstraction. But what you can do instead, and what we've been giving as advice, is which works when your framework is the same as the one the users are using. So for our view components, people can copy paste our thing into theirs and then do it like that. So right now that's the way that we're going there. However, there's indeed still something missing there where maybe we should be exporting them with a bunch of options or the internal building blocks. Yes?
Did you drop any features because one of the frameworks didn't have it or didn't support it?
Not exactly like that, but we have cases where one of the frameworks in the experimental phase, we got towards something that was not yet in our other ones. And the way that we go there is we try to consolidate it eventually, but then we are clear about it, saying like, okay, this one exists here. We don't have the specific easy way to do it in the other one, and then we write down the workaround in our documentation.
So it's not consistent in that case?
Yes, we try to become eventually consistent, but not consistent at every time. Yes?
I see this approach you described as pretty interesting way to make application code more properly open sourced. I mean, so application code often is very opinionated about what you're doing, but when you make this in an open source project, you want your users to be able to customize it. So these tiered abstractions can be a way to achieve this. However, from my tuition, it seems like a lot of work to achieve this level of granularity in the way users can customize it. So I was wondering if maybe you've seen other ways, like maybe build time substitutions or things like that, that could enable users to achieve what they can achieve this way, but with less code maybe on your own.
I think the main way to go is to give multiple ways of consuming something that you want. So imagine in your whole app you're using styled components and stuff like that, and maybe you don't want to force this on your users. The first step is to be as unopinionated as possible where you want to afford it. If you don't, then you should maybe export the inner things as well, or go for more a copy-paste approach. But it depends what the goal is. There's a very interesting project by Ryan Florence, who makes Reach UI. Basically, the goal there is to take conceptual things that really should have been part of the DOM but are not, like a drop-down list or a modal. And the way that he goes there is just stay as unopinionated as possible. Don't do any crazy stuff with styling, don't do any crazy brand-specific stuff. only export those things because those are reusable for everything, and the rest just keep it for yourself. There's probably not that much value in other people trying to have the exact same thing as you, unless it's something that you're selling. Like, you're not selling how to make your own brand website the same as ours, but a little bit different. Yes?
Do you have an idea of how much shared code you could have for these abstractions that are
So right now, most of the code is shared for this. The only code which needs to be rewritten for the framework is a tiny little boilerplate to set up the listeners for our own store instance, and to add the reactivity and to start and stop the instance when necessary. That comes down to like maybe 20 lines or something, and those can be shared between the components. Then what you need to rewrite, of course, is the whole view itself. At some point we might go for like another layer of abstraction, maybe with web components or whatever, but right now these are not fully baked enough for us to go with that. So yeah, that's what you need to rewrite, the view part.
Bon, je pense qu'on va arrêter les questions. On pourra continuer autour des pizzas. Hein. Donc merci.